Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lance Pressel. I'll be your moderator for this panel. It's a delight and an honor to be here with all of you, and I'm very thankful to Dean Pagano for inviting me and for all of the panelists to join us today, and for all of you. I know you had a choice of airlines today, and you chose. So thank you very much. How many of you attended the first panel? Good. Okay. How many of you are really depressed? Well, you're in the right spot, because we're going to cheer you up, because economic development is a place where we can grow new firms, create new firms, grow existing firms, and bring new firms to the region from places beyond Indiana, Wisconsin, and Iowa, and other places. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And I hope we're able to boost your spirits. We have a big panel, as you can tell, and we're going to be short on time. So the one thing I'm going to do is crack the whip and try to keep everybody on time. And we're going to begin by having each of the members of the panel provide 3 minutes of opening kind of remarks and give their initial thoughts. And then we're going to engage in a conversation among the panelists, and then you get your chance to ask all of us questions. And I hope by now you've received your 3x5 cards, so fill those out and make sure the team around the room has them and they can feed them up to me. But one new addition for the panelists, I'm going to ask each of you at the end to have one specific recommendation for key stakeholders in our region that they can take action upon. So be thinking of that. The theme of this panel is about economic growth. And the question that we're grappling with here is whether proven strategies of urban development can be made new. And it seems to me that at one level we can just say yes or no. So I'm going to ask all of you in the audience, those of you who believe that kind of the traditional but successful strategies and tools for urban development can be made new, can be tweaked. Why don't you raise your hand and let's see how many of you are out there. Okay, a fair number of you. How many of you think that our traditional tools and strategies just need to be thrown out the window and start fresh? Raise your hand. How many of you are hoping we give you the answer and have to think too much? Well, we hope to at least engage you in a thoughtful conversation about that. My own view on this, and as I've thought about this with my work with the Organization for Economic Cooperation and my previous experience when I ran the foundation for the Chicagoland Chamber of Commerce, is the following. I think the lens through which we view these kinds of issues has changed. And my work with the OECD has introduced me to an approach they've taken, but it's also been simultaneously adopted by the European Union. And they think of economic growth in having to accomplish 3 things. And I think this is the new lens that I hope we can all think about. First, they think about economic development having to be smart, meaning growth has to focus on innovation and new knowledge, so smart. The second thing is growth has to be sustainable. We have to use our resources more efficiently and not create the kind of waste that we've done in the past. And lastly, growth must be inclusive. It must include all sectors of our communities and not leave anyone out. So I suggest that as we look at our existing tools, think about new tools, we keep those 3 things in mind. Now, let's see what our panelists have to say. So Teresa Cordova is going to lead us off, and she's been newly appointed as the director of the UIC's Great Cities Institute. She also serves as professor of urban planning and policy in the College of Urban Planning and Public Affairs. Teresa, thank Thank you for joining us.
You know, there are a few chairs, and maybe folks in the back at least can come and use up some of the chairs. So I invite you to step forward, whoever you'd like.
We can use all of your warmth in here, by the way.
There are a few chairs if you want to come forward. Well, because we are limited to 3 minutes, I'm going to read my remarks, okay? Which I don't normally do, but here I go. Good afternoon, Mayor, Lance, fellow panelists. As director of UIC's Great Cities Institute, I think about the question, what is it that cities and regions can do to make themselves into great places? Cities are, for the most part, great places, centers of activity and sites of opportunity and achievement. As large human settlements, however, they pose challenges that at times are greater than the resources we have to meet them. We are in such a time. In a time of economic turmoil. We are therefore in need of metropolitan resilience. And so we gather today to consider strategies by which we can overcome the problems facing our metropolitan regions. This panel is addressing economic growth and the question of whether proven strategies of urban development can be made new. In my remarks, I begin by suggesting that the current orthodoxy on how best to address the conditions of limited resources actually exacerbates and perpetuates our problems. I then propose that the concept of economic growth needs to be viewed in terms of inclusion, thank you, Linz, thus opening more possibilities for innovation. Strategies that we pursue should expand opportunities for wider participation in the economy. Not to do so is to deepen a cycle and potentially doom generations that will follow. From wider participation will come unforeseen innovation. We know that today's economic turmoil is rooted in government and corporate policies that trace back to the mid-70s and 80s. Deindustrialization, aided by neoliberal policies, for example, stripped communities of an employment base and replaced it with problems that for 40 years have become institutionalized. As the social contract has been eroded and government budgets have shrunk, these same neoliberal economic policies cry for austerity measures, further shredding social safety nets and placing additional burdens on local governments. The presumption is that huge cuts without increased revenue will deliver economic prosperity. We have no evidence to that effect, and in fact, compelling evidence to the contrary. The mayor of Columbus this morning provided us evidence that demonstrates that you need the revenues as well. If you engage in austerities, you cut out the opportunities for growth in the very places that need it most, locking in long-term economic disadvantages and even more pressures for public services without the means to pay for them. The downward spiral of austerity and its parallel policies of privatization are in fact another, perhaps more devastating form of deficit spending, leaving for future generations increasingly more difficult problems to solve. You don't grow an economy by limiting who can participate in it. Our policies, therefore, need to be policies of inclusion. Expand economic opportunities where unemployment is highest. Build strong local economies at the community and neighborhood levels. Find ways to circulate capital within those communities to generate investment, small business development, and other neighborhood stabilizing measures. Seek ways to expand employment, including workforce development, and improve transportation to provide access to jobs. Create alternative lending institutions. Provide our young men of color access to employment through youth entrepreneurship and reentry strategies. Most importantly, use opportunities of inclusion to bring forward possibilities of innovation. What we need is innovative inclusion. So, can proven strategies of urban development be made new? Yes, they can, but they need to be adapted to communities and their needs. We build metropolitan resilience by creating resilient communities through structural economic opportunities that are flexible and adaptable to change. The strength of our urban development policies has been to expand the base of opportunity while encouraging creativity. Policies of inclusion are more likely to improve our metropolitan regions than are policies of austerity. A great city is a city of inclusion.
Thank you very much, Teresa. Dr. Jeff Hewings will be next. He's director of the Regional Economics Applications Laboratory at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, as well as a professor in the departments of geography, economics, agriculture and consumer economics, urban and regional planning, and serves in the Institute of Government and Public Affairs. I'm not sure how you ever have time to do anything else.
Thank you very much, Lance, and I'm pleased to be here. I don't trust myself to keep to 3 minutes without reading my remarks, so I will follow Teresa's lead. The bottom line is that I think too much in this country we tend to rush into policy without spending the time to understand how the economies work. And I'll give you the medical analogy. If you went in to see a physician, and without looking at you, the physician wrote a prescription for what ailed you, you would not have much confidence in that physician. And yet so many of the policies that have been enacted for urban areas have been done without any understanding of how those urban areas work. So understanding urban resilience requires understanding how these economies interact with the rest of the world, their external interdependencies through trade, and how they work internally, their internal interdependencies. In the US over the past 3 decades, we have witnessed how decreases in the real costs of transportation have propelled a dramatic increase in interstate trade, much of it centered on flows between metropolitan regions. This interstate trade growth is exceeding the growth of gross metropolitan products. As a result, Illinois is now part of a 5-state region whose interstate trade would place it 6th or 7th in the world in terms of trade partners. Sadly, our political leadership in the Midwest has failed to comprehend and to exploit the advantages of this remarkable economy over which they preside. The gains from trade are well documented, but urban systems have been profoundly changed by 2 factors. One, the hollowing out of economies that has come about, secondly, as a result of the fragmentation of production chains. Firms have dramatically reorganized their production systems to take advantage of these cheaper transportation costs and to exploit scale economies by producing a larger percentage of their products in a smaller number of locations. As a result, the multiplier or ripple effects of economic change within any given metropolitan region have declined over time, while the interregional or the spillover effects have increased. What is the result of this? Urban economies are now at one and the same time both more competitive and more complementary with other urban and regional economies. And this challenges the efficacy of any cluster-based development strategy. Further, the empirical evidence challenges state economic development strategies designed to lure firms from nearby states, as happened when, for example, Indiana had advertising, "Are you Illinois? Come move your firm over to Indiana," when we raised personal and corporate income taxes. Unraveling the supply chains in one state may generate significant negative effects on the state economy trying to lure a component. Metropolitan economies need to see themselves as part of a broader, more spatially extensive set of regional economies, a phenomenon that the recent OECD report that our distinguished chairman was able to lure for the tri-state region very clearly established. Hence, if we're to understand the resiliency of a single urban economy, we need to know and to understand its connections with the national and international urban system, how these are changing, and what opportunities and challenges are likely to enhance or to unravel past economic successes. Myopically focusing only on what happens inside our metropolitan regions will miss comprehending the essential new economic geography of development. While we need to know how our internal economies function and operate, it is this connection with the external world that provides the keys to success. Our lab is now part of a new initiative under the umbrella Regeneration Economies. And our mantra, with apologies to Albert Einstein, is we cannot solve today's economic development problems with the the same thinking that got us here. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. Dr. Rachel Weber is next. Rachel serves as an associate professor in urban planning and policy program at UIC, where she conducts research and teaches courses in the fields of economic development, real estate, and public finance. She's also associate director of the UIC's Great Cities Institute. Rachel?
Thank you. So I was also depressed after those first sessions, and I'm going to try to sort of sketch out what I see as some possible silver linings in this new normal or the municipal fiscal crisis. So first, it's possible that cities will no longer be able to pass off real estate development as economic development, as growth. In an anti-government climate, it makes sense that cities gravitated toward real estate solutions to difficult problems. Real estate markets, after all, leverage private investment, produce visible physical improvements, and they can be influenced by the commonplace tools of the trade like zoning and property tax incentives. But I'd like to think that the last boom and bust cycle taught us a couple of lessons. One is that debt-fueled, inflated property values are not the same as prosperity, that new office construction doesn't mean that there are new jobs, and that more big boxes don't necessarily signal new population or income growth. Bursting bubbles should reorient economic development policy back to the needs of occupants, namely access and training. And governments should focus on the conditions that lead the private market to invest in real estate. The basics of infrastructure that connect businesses with employees, suppliers, and customers, and workforce development through community colleges and vocational high schools, these are the kind of economic development that can actually help businesses grow, while also extending the prosperity enjoyed by the city's professional classes into lower income households and neighborhoods. Second, I'd like to think that subsidies may become obsolete, and in their place, real infrastructure planning and real tax reform. So like real estate, financial incentives like sales tax rebates, abatements, and TIF give the impression that cities are doing something tangible to pursue growth. My research and that of others shows that these incentives are not particularly effective at job or wealth creation, that they're expensive to the public fisc and they're expensive to administer, and that copycat behavior dilutes their power. Even the staunchest advocates admit that they're pro-cyclical, that they don't work in poor places or during recessionary periods, and that on a national and regional level, we would probably all be better off without them. If any of you saw the New York Times series that one of our speakers mentioned that was written earlier this week, you'll see that there was a quote from an economic developer from Missouri who said, "There ought to be a law against what I'm doing." So let's take advantage of this crisis to reduce our reliance on economic development incentives, which cost state and local governments an estimated $70 billion annually. However, I wouldn't suggest taking such drastic action without being able to put an alternative on the table. For years, I've been a tweaker in terms of what do we do with these strategies. I've said, well, we can use these economic development incentives, but we just got to do it smarter. I'm beginning to lose my patience with them, however, as I see them misused and abused in different contexts. Instead, I'd like to propose a robust capital improvements plan that focuses on area-wide infrastructure in a systematic way, instead of the kind of one-off projects that are funded by incentives, where cities have little control over what takes place or actual job creation. Moreover, at the end of the day, we would have a modernized public realm that endures long after individual businesses leave, in addition to creating a kind of quasi-public works program. We could use those incentives. They are a cost to cities, but if we targeted them toward areas instead of individual businesses, I think we would see greater results. Also, in the place of incentives, I would propose rationalized, legible, and fair tax systems, ones that don't push a disproportionate burden onto business, don't confuse them with multiple loopholes, and don't start from the assumption that businesses will have to appeal their property tax bills. Incentives are used to compensate for high tax rates, but selective tax relief would be less necessary if the whole system was overhauled. This is a nonpartisan issue. Democratically controlled California has taken advantage of steep deficits to get rid of their TIF program, and I doubt that business attraction and redevelopment strategies or redevelopment there is going to come to a screeching halt. Republican Governor Tim Snyder in Michigan recently got rid of the mega tax credit, while also lowering corporate income taxes and getting rid of loopholes. And somewhere in between Republican and Democrat, we've got quirky New Hampshire, which offers very few incentives but also has no sales tax or income tax. Cities will keep playing the incentive game because they're caught in a vicious prisoner's dilemma that requires either everyone to play it or no one to play it. It's very hard to defect. So I draw inspiration from Raphael's great white paper for this session, where he draws an analogy with Alcoholics Anonymous, talking about how cities have to first admit that they have a problem, that self-awareness, and I'll extend this metaphor to say that cities will need sponsors. They will need regions and states and even the federal government to help them quit this expensive addiction and return them to proven growth strategies.
Thank you, Rachel. Mayor, we're going to skip over you and let you close this first part of the session and jump over to Dr. Raphael Bostic, who serves as a Judith and John Bedrosian Chair in Governance and Public Enterprise at the Sol Price School of Public Policy at the University of Southern California.
So good afternoon, everyone. It's good to see you all. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to be here, and it's kind of ironic for me to follow your comments. The Price School is of the Price Club, which is a big box retail developer, which some have said is a problem. I actually missed the memo. I didn't prepare a full thing to read. And it turns out that that's probably a good thing, because there's a lot there to react to and respond to. So I had my 3-minute spiel, but I'm going to go in a slightly different way. A couple of things that we need to think about. The first is, what's the role of economics, and what's the role of economics globally and at the neighborhood level? And they answer that as different at the different levels of geography, and how you respond to it will impact and influence how successful you can be, who succeeds, who benefits, and who's left out. And those are important issues, important questions. And I think much of the economic development infrastructure that's in place is really around equity and trying to make sure that as many people are as included as possible, because as I tell my undergrads all the time, the free market gets you to an efficient outcome, but not necessarily an optimal distribution of goods. And since we care about that, we might need to intervene in ways that don't seem as positive as you think. The second thing I think is important is the question of, can you manage this, and what does management mean, and what does it look like? And how do you know if you're being successful in shaping your region or your neighborhood's response to the broader economics? That's a hard question, and it's a question that we actually need to have an explicit conversation about. And in too many places we don't have that conversation. It's actually interesting. When I was at HUD, I was an assistant secretary there. I asked my staff, what are the examples of successful economic development? I mean, get to your first question. Do we have any examples of successful economic development? And the one case that came out which was interesting was Denver. And Denver redeveloped their lower downtown, the Lodo area. And what they did was they had a citywide conversation about which neighborhoods were going to be invested in, at what levels, and which ones were going to be invested in at lower levels. And it was an explicit conversation, and it was an explicit discussion about what success looked like and how that was going to play out. I think that's actually really interesting, and those sorts of conversations happen far too rarely when we think about how economic development plays out, so we should think about that. The other thing that I did want to emphasize, and this is in my little 3-minute spiel, is the notion of self-awareness, and that communities and regions need to know what they're good at, what they're not good at, what they have and what they don't have, so they can figure out what sorts of things they should invest in terms of their infrastructure, in terms of the linkages to the broader economies and to neighborhoods, and in terms of their people, because ultimately you have to have the people there to be able to do the work, to fill the jobs, and if you don't have that, no one's going to come. And so we need to think about that as well. And then the last piece I would just put out to say that it needs to be explicitly put out there. It is not going to be the case that the public sector alone is going to be able to do this. Right? If we're going to see successful economic development, we must have a broad-based coalition, including the private sector, including the nonprofit sector, including foundations, and including all of you, in the sense that we all have a civic responsibility to sacrifice and to get out there and to do the hard nuts and bolts work that needs to be done if this is going to succeed.
Thank you, Raphael. Raphael, as Rachel mentioned, is the author of the white paper that we're all kind of looking at and supports this panel. So if you haven't taken a look at that, please do. It's a well-written piece. And
There's a bit, but it's
we're very honored to have Mayor Karen Freeman Wilson with us. On December 31st, she'll celebrate her first year in office as the mayor of Gary. She is the first woman to be elected to be mayor of Gary, and she's the first African-American woman to be elected mayor in the state of Indiana. So we're very honored to have you with us, Mayor. Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, I'm Karen, I'm a mayor, and I need help. And keeping in that tradition of Alcoholics Anonymous. It is a tremendous honor and pleasure to be with this distinguished group of panelists and these academicians. Now to the real world. You know, one of the things that I want to say, and I want to place our conversation in the context of what we found. We have a 42% poverty rate. We're listed at a 13% unemployment rate, but when you account for the people who have stopped looking or who never looked, we have a 30% unemployment rate in the city of Gary. We have a 25% vacancy rate. At our height, we had 175,000 people, and that was in the late 60s, early 70s. Currently, we have 80,000 people living in the city of Gary. And U.S. Steel, who was the major employer in the city for the longest, had 25,000 people in the late 60s, early 70s. They now employ a little over 4,000 people. We have a 70% tax collection rate. Our budget in 2006 was $60 million. It is currently $28 million. And so, you know, if you weren't depressed this morning, you ought to be depressed right around here. But we also have a beautiful lakefront that is ripe for both recreational and residential development. We have tremendous underdeveloped assets in the transportation arena, and we sit at the population center of North America, only 30 miles away from the third largest city in the country. And so our approach has been to take advantage of some very clear assets, the first among which is transportation. And so we have focused on a woefully underdeveloped airport. We focused on 3 Class 1 rail lines that run through our city. And we've also focused on the confluence of major interstate highways and the trucking companies that are located in the city of Gary. There's 6 of the 10 largest trucking companies available that are existing in the United States that have terminals, large terminals in the city of Gary. That means that I have 4 other trucking companies to convince to locate in the city of Gary. But in addition to that, we understand that we have to develop our way out, but it's not the traditional development of the use of TIFs and the other tax incentives that have been used, but it's also to look at what is our long-term strategy, what are our long-term plans. And so land use is very important, and long-term planning for land use. How do we deal with the abandoned buildings? What is our strategy there? But it's also to look at the wealth level of our residents. How do we increase the wealth of our residents? Is it that we simply need to move people in so that we can lower our poverty rate? I don't think that's the answer. It is to look at the residents who live in poverty and to create job opportunities, to create investment opportunities for them so that we can in fact reduce the poverty rate by helping the existing residents of our city. And I also believe ultimately that the creation of a public-private partnership that really does engage the private sector, the not-for-profit sector, and residents. The residents of Gary have to have ownership in the revitalization of our community. And so often, people tend to develop around existing residents because they don't believe that they get it. But they get it because they understand it better than any other developer could, because our residents, as residents, we live it every day.
Thank you, Mayor. I wasn't going to ask this right off the bat, but I will, just because of the mayor's comments. Can Chicago and the surrounding suburban community be a global city with the statistics and the facts that Mayor Freeman Wilson just outlined?
Depends on how you define global city. I mean, if a city that's engaged in activity that has international exchange of capital and goods and services, then yes, we certainly can. But one of the problems in the kinds of competition that's necessary to do that is that a lot of other communities, a lot of other people are left out of that. So it depends how you define it.
Yeah.
So I think Chicago is a global city, and it's going to be for a long time. The question is, what do we make of it? Who benefits, and how collective we view the city's functioning in terms of lifting all boats. And there's work to be done on that. I mean, I think there's a lot of work. We were talking yesterday. Do people in Chicago view Gary as being in its umbrella and in its sphere, or do they view it as some other that we should look elsewhere and just focus on something else? And so one of the questions is, can Gary contribute to Chicago's success and power as a global city? It absolutely can. There are entrepreneurial people, smart people, energized people, people with ambition who actually want to make things of themselves, their community, and the broader world. But again, we've got to talk about that. And we've got to say, who is our community? What counts in our regional window or umbrella? And then how do we then incorporate those assets into the things that exist and break down some of the isolation and the barriers that prevent some of that success from flowing through?
Any other thoughts?
I just think there are multiple cities, right? We have at least, 10, 12 different Chicagos, and you have one that is, highly connected to to global trade and has all kinds of, if not regional connections, certainly global connections. And these are not just employees of firms that may be, from maybe some form of foreign direct investment or global corporations, but people who, just by looking at the kinds of contacts that people have, their worlds are bigger than Chicago. And if you look at flight patterns out of O'Hare, which is one sort of metric that people have used to see what is and isn't a global city, Chicago would certainly count. But then you can talk to people who have never left their neighborhoods, or who don't leave their neighborhoods on a regular basis, and who only know the half square mile radius around their house, the grocery store, the school, and that's about it. So I would say it's hard to make a blanket generalization for a city, but I would say to sort of look at the sort of different communities and to the extent to which they have global connections and global relationships.
Well, and as a global city or set of cities and neighborhoods, I mean, part of it is what are we contributing to the world in terms of the kinds of knowledge and innovation that we're producing. So the more, again, inclusivity and the more people are involved in that, in the dynamics and creativity, the more likely we are to be able to put that out, put that forward, right? So I think our education system is really key, and we have to really be encouraging people to be developing their intellectual capacities, because that's part of where innovation will come.
And it's not just Gary. I mean, Aurora, Racine to our north, and obviously a number of other cities are suffering similar challenges. But I think very important question. Raphael, in your paper, you talk about, and it was referenced to in the panel, kind of the self-awareness that you can't move forward and develop new or achieve better results without understanding where you are today where you're going. Can you talk a little bit more about that? And then maybe the rest of the panel can begin to think about who are the key stakeholders. I think there was general consensus this morning that government can't do it, but then who do we look to? Where do we get the leadership?
Sure. So I want to respond to that, tie it back to your first question. Is can you take the new or the old models and recreate them as new? And I think you actually have to, in the sense that the places that aren't working, they've tried the old. They've actually applied just about every strategy that you could, and it hasn't worked. And so we're going to have to figure out how to reshuffle, rearrange those things to make them work better for the local context. And one thing I saw, I think the first thing I realized when I was at HUD is that the United States is an extremely large place, and there are a lot of places, right? And each of them has their own connections and linkages, which means that while you have programs and strategies, each place is going to have to figure out how to apply it in the way that best takes advantage of what's going on and avoids the biggest problems there, which means that you have to know your place, and you have to know what works in your place, you have to know where your weaknesses are, and you have to be willing to, maybe not publicly, but call them out and say, look, organization X, we know you work hard, you're doing a lot of stuff, but it is not changing the dynamic. And organization Y, you guys don't talk to the 4 people who you should be talking to every day. Right? And someone or an organization has to create that structure so that we understand where our weaknesses and our strengths are, so that we can build a strategy that doesn't put weaker people in key positions where they become a bottleneck or a barrier to success. And that self-awareness, that self-knowledge, that doesn't happen very often. And if you look across the country, one of the reasons why I've held some hope for Detroit, for example, is that they know they're broken, right? And you gotta know you're broken before you can start to try to get fixed. Cleveland is another place that knows that it needs to do something different. And they have started, you've seen all sorts of innovations come out in Cleveland, which is one of the most interesting cities I've been to in the last 4 or 5 years. Now, all of those innovations may not work, but because they have gotten to a point where they understand themselves, they know which things are more likely to work and can focus resources on those. And that kind of self-awareness is critical. I was actually very surprised this morning. So I'm one of the few non-Midwesterners here. And I just spent 3 years in Washington around a bunch of Chicagoans. Right? And it was great. I had a great time. But they talked about Chicago as if there were no problems. This was the great city with the most interesting innovations. And so for me to hear the numbers today was actually quite interesting. And it puts a different light on how we here in this city are thinking about ourselves and view what success and what challenges look like. And that was actually quite interesting.
Mayor, I'm going to come back to you in a minute, but just want to ask Rachel or Jeff to comment on this notion of who leads. Jeff, you point that we're not, who leads? Who takes the leadership role in this? You comment that we're not global enough. We're not taking advantage or leveraging that. How do we get there?
I think it's been a source of frustration that I think a lot of our leaders have very good intentions, but I don't think they understand some very fundamental things about economics. And I would like to promulgate a law in economics in the state that no more lawyers in public office. I'm being facetious, but I think it really does limit our ability to get our arms around the problem when we're not willing to invest and understand. And as a result, we've had an amazing, over the 40 years I've lived in the state, series of catastrophic policy decisions that have been based upon what it felt good, rather than we did the objective analysis to do that. And the second answer to your question is, I think in a metropolitan tri-state region like this, unless the leadership comes from the largest city, it's not going to happen. And so basically, the mantle is on Rahm Emanuel sort of stand up and to really coalesce the thinking, bring people together, and to understand that this is going to be in the best interest of Chicago to have a 12 million dynamic region, because we're going to benefit dramatically from having a stronger Gary, from having a stronger Racine, from having a stronger Milwaukee.
Rachel, any additions?
Yeah, I was struck by the difference in tone between Mayor Emanuel last night, who spoke at our reception, and then Deputy Mayor Steve Koch today. I think there is sort of maybe a disconnect between the politicians and the folks who are looking at the books, and that divide really needs to be breached for there to be some real change. I think there's some, I understand why this takes place, but there's a little bit of kind of collective denial and a need to always be pitching your city and talking about all the good things that are taking place, and that's what you heard at HUD from our. But I think underlying that, again, there are a lot of different Chicagos there, and something that the OECD analysis revealed is, being honest about slowing growth rates, the continuation of deindustrialization. There are a lot of problems with the Chicago region's economy that I feel don't get touched, because we still have to be talking about how great everything is, and that is almost a growth strategy to talk to. And the thinking is that we'll sort of convince ourselves, we'll convince everybody around us, and that will lead to new business attraction. But I think, I have a bias here, but I think the organizations that do analysis tend to have a better sense of what's going on, and oftentimes that isn't local governments. They don't have the time or the staff to do that kind of work, so we rely on educational institutions, foundations, regional organizations to help tell us what's taking place. And I don't really see a way out of the subsidy problem and the fact that where you should be having regional collaboration, you often have an awful lot of interjurisdictional competition that's keeping you from acting like a region. And sort of wearing the mantle of not just the Chicago region, but the greater Midwest region, because we're still poaching businesses from Indiana, and they're poaching from us, and we're victims and we're victors in this game. And so you do need some sort of supra-level government agency, I think, to try to curb that kind of behavior and to lead, to take a cold look at how much these policies cost the individual, cost the region, even if they are a boon to a particular municipality or to a particular neighborhood within a municipality.
Mayor, you talked about, right back to, you've admitted you need help, we got that. And it's clear to me, knowing you for over a year now, that your leadership skills are bubbling up. But who are you looking to help you? You can't do it alone. The city of Gary, the government of Gary doesn't have the resources. What is your safety net?
Well, and this really does speak to the suggestions here. We've been very, very fortunate to develop alliances with the University of Chicago, with Indiana University, with Purdue University, with faculty at Ivy Tech College. And as a result of that, we've gotten the benefit of that research. As an example, at the Indiana University School of Public and Environmental Affairs, they work with our police department to help them target where they focus law enforcement efforts. And it's been extremely successful, because every week they sit down with professors there and determine what are the areas that we should target. It doesn't cost us anything. It certainly is a great advantage for Indiana University. Another example, we don't have, the staff that we have in the General Services Department, the people who fill potholes, who do the things that you think of when you think of cities. They don't have the same number of employees, and so we were able to employ GIS technology through the advice of the University of Chicago Harris School students to say, okay, let's use GIS technology to really focus our resources in specific areas on a weekly basis, so that you'll be able to serve more people. And so those are two concrete ways that we benefited from our relationships with universities. But I think to the higher point of the concern that those of us who are in elected office sort of play to the need to get reelected more than we play to the need to provide good government. I don't think, at least from my perspective, those objectives are mutually exclusive. And I think at some point you have to be willing to take the political risk to say, I'm going to do this because it represents good government in the long term, rather than provide something that represents what people want to see in the short term. But at the same time, developing those opportunities to provide the short-term solution, because if I'm not there, then I can't provide good government in the first place.
Some of you who are old enough to remember Governor Ogilvie in Illinois created the income tax in Illinois in the late 60s. He was advised before he did that he would lose re-election. Guess what? He lost re-election. But I think the state is better off because of the income tax. I wanted to come back to you, Teresa, and talk about this notion, and I forget the word exactly you used. Innovative inclusion. Talk more about that and convince the naysayer that says, no, I don't think so. I don't believe that.
You know, well, first of all, I think it is a two-pronged approach. I mean, it is an approach that is, I mean, if you think about what economic development is, it's trying to get some export-based economic activity, things that you can sell outside and bring your capital back inside. So we tend to go for the big corporations or the big job generators, right? But the other strategy that needs to be at least as elevated as that one, if not more so, is a strategy that tries to do it at a smaller scale, I think. Because the other one has tended to leave out a lot of folks at the neighborhood and community levels. We just need to go to our communities in Chicago and in Gary and around to see that the trickle isn't coming down. So it seems to me that one of the things that if we're providing, for example, opportunities to produce goods at the neighborhood level, the community level, and though some of those goods can be circulated outside to bring capital back into those communities. But by circulating that capital, you're generating more economic activity. So I think that is part of it. But the more you include people, the more you're going to get the generation of innovation. We think a lot of times that if you just bring the leaders, for example, together, they will have everything there is to say about what can be said. But what you find when you really approach it in a community-based way, and you really provide multiple voices, and those multiple voices are going to bring to the table a whole lot of creative ideas that otherwise wouldn't be there. So yeah, the idea of including people and using those ideas as a basis for innovation, I think you're going to generate not only ideas for further innovation, but also ways to turn that innovation into export-based products that you can then use to generate more circulation of capital.
So, can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
Because there are a lot of ideas out there, and how do you decide? I mean, all these places have a finite number of resources, and they don't have unlimited money to fund all of the potential innovations. How do you decide which of the ones are the ones that we should pursue? So I have a community meeting or a series of them, and we wind up with 14 ideas. And so 3 people come and say, we got an idea for this great new backpack. And 2 others come up and say, I think we can get a new bike that everyone. Who manages that process? And I think it's back to Lance's question about how do you decide who the leader is and who gets to make a decision, and where do the resources come from, and how does that all work?
Why doesn't it have to be one leader is part of the question. I think
it could be a consortium.
It's partly expanding the idea of who has not only we ask the question of who are the stakeholders, but who are the holders of knowledge, who should be the holders of decisions around that. So that part of it is gonna be, part of what gets decided, what is a good idea, are those who would be users of that idea, for example. I mean, how does any good business idea get determined as a good business idea?
But the problem is someone's got to fund that idea, right? And
Well, that's why, one of the things I think we need to start doing is providing alternative lending institutions into these communities. Because a lot of times, the big banks are not gonna provide capital to a lot of the activities that might occur at a neighborhood or community scale. So if you provide lending institutions, they're gonna work with communities to do that. You can expand the numbers of things that can be funded. So is it the case that not everything can be funded? Of course, right? Are there processes that can be used through a community-based planning approach, for example, that can bring to fore certain ideas that make more sense than others, that are more viable, that are more implementable, that are more likely to be successful, that will meet the given needs, provide local goods and services? Then yes. And part of the point that I'm making is that we need to invest in those kinds of processes in order to come up with those outcomes. We aren't putting hardly any resources towards that. And so I begin by saying we need to put direction and focus towards that. Or as Mayor from Columbus said, he talked about that laser beam in job generation, and which I think was fabulous, everything he had to say, right? But I think we can talk about a laser beam that builds up local economies.
Raphael, I think your question, and Jeff, I'll come right back to you. It continues, the question of who leads and who are the group of stakeholders is still unanswered in my mind. When we work with the OECD, their creation of government, so they usually defer to government doing more or less in their final recommendation on what to do in a regional area. In our case, they thought that government was a problem, so they couldn't recommend less or more, actually. So what they concluded was that the civic and business community needs to take a much stronger role in dictating kind of a vision for the region, supported by the regional planning organizations in the tri-state region, supported by the universities, not only in a workforce sense, but also as a catalyst and a stimulus for innovation. And then finally, government at all levels. And what hasn't come up yet in any of our discussion, I don't want to get on it now, but is what the role of the federal government is. But I want to go to a question then.
I would also say the unions are missing. I mean, I think in sort of some of the strongest partnerships I've seen, the ones that have been able to achieve, have created really effective workforce development systems,
Yep.
the unions were at the table.
So thank you for filling out questions. So there's one for you, Jeff. And it says, you talked about the importance of interstate trade to the region. What kind of public policies are necessary to maximize the benefits from this trade? So start off with you and any other folks.
Well, I think the first thing is to understand that the gains from trade can accrue to both the buyers and the sellers. And I think that one of Chicago's amazingly competitive positions is our location and the incredible investment that's being made over many hundreds of years in transportation infrastructure. But I think that to really fully invest in this, when I talk to politicians, particularly a previous governor of Illinois who's currently not in jail, by the way, and I would point out to him that our supply chain in one particular automobile company that's feeding companies outside of the state is larger than the amount of goods and services they provide to the company in the state. And that's why we should be excited to see Michigan growing, to see Ohio growing, and to see Indiana growing. And he can't understand that. Because for him, those state boundaries mean something. And from an economic perspective, they don't. And it's very, very hard for us to get policymakers to understand that there is some positive sum gain for us for growth that takes place in the surrounding areas. And you look that the private sector has understood this because the volume of interstate trade has been increasing so rapidly in the last 20 years, and yet we're not exploiting it. And in any other part of the world, you would have an organization, the European Union, ASEAN, whatever, to try to take advantage of this. And my dream would be something like the Council of Great Lakes Governors would understand this. So you'd have coordinated investment strategy. You'd have harmonization of transportation, for example, trucking fees. communities across states and so forth. We would all benefit from this. Now, that's a very, very hard sell to a politician inside an individual state.
Rachel, this is for you, not directly, but I'm going to ask you anyway. It says we know what the market has to do with development, and this is not part of the question, but you and I were talking by email about whether or not we need to be activists, stimulate market growth, or do we do the Milton Friedman thing and just say the market will take care of itself? But the question on the note card was, what does democracy have to do with economic development?
Well, I think it gets back to Teresa's point about inclusiveness. I think the more people that are involved in planning for economic development, the better plans we'll end up with. What we typically have is we have some combination of elites and experts come up with economic development plans. And that's what we've got in the Chicago region, and that's just been sort of how we've typically done it. We trust the Growth Coalition, we trust academics to sort of figure things out. And we've made some very bad mistakes because of that. And we've come up with plans that are not meant to, raise all ships, or that are, myopic or only focused on particular sectors where have the highest skilled jobs, and so folks that are seeking entry-level jobs or don't have high school diplomas won't be able to kind of latch on to that labor market. So I think democracy is critical in economic development planning, and then in participating in sort of figuring out the kinds of strategies that are useful. And I think because we're engaged in something called the Participatory Budgeting Project right now. We've got 4 aldermen in the city of Chicago who basically said, tell us how to spend our discretionary capital funds. So it's not going to be expert-led. So the city's agencies are out of it. The alderman's not going to be elite-led or elected official-led. It's basically sort of putting good ideas out for the community to do research on, to cost out, and then to vote on. So there are, and these methods have worked very, very well in Latin America and in countries in Asia and Canada. The United States has been very slow to adopt these kinds of methods. So there are very choreographed, structured ways of including people who are typically not included in this process.
The last question I want to ask of the mayor and Raphael to kind of join in together. It actually talks about the importance of public health and its role in economic development and economic growth. So with high levels of poverty, unemployment in Gary, public health has to be an issue, and it has to impede your ability to transform the city. And Raphael, you've seen this through your experience in HUD.
It's a huge issue, and at HUD we've decided that housing is a health intervention. If you get people housed well, then they actually wind up being healthier. They have far fewer acute illnesses. They don't have the diabetes. They don't fall. They stay in work and all that stuff. And we don't talk about the full range of policy areas as contributing to broader economic development. So, and how they intersect, right? And so, I actually think it's a really important thing. And one hope that I have, it's one of my soapbox issues, is that the coalition of experts and field people who should be in the economic development conversation should be much broader than what it is now. And there are movements to get health professionals, have a slot on every planning commission that goes to a public health person or a doctor to make sure that we think about these issues when they come in. There are lots of things that are evolving, and it's something we definitely have to pay attention to.
And Mayor, as you're commenting, I want the rest of you to think about your one recommendation that we can take to action. So any thoughts on the importance of health and economic development?
Absolutely. Public health is a key component of economic development. That's why one of our chief areas for economic development is around a teaching hospital and a trauma center. We understand that, and we understand also the importance of viewing violence as a public health issue.
Okay, this is our lightning round. One recommendation that stakeholders can take home and do something with it. Who wants to start? I won't pick on anybody.
Don't everyone look at me.
the outsiders, so it falls to you.
I'll try something.
Lightning round.
Council of Mayors, including the major surrounding cities, to develop an MOU that says development in your town helps my town.
Great. Mayor.
I would suggest that as we look towards our planning efforts for economic development and talk about the notion of inclusivity, that we really do deal with that at the community level. So if I'm going to plan a workforce development program, then I need to have someone who's been unemployed for 10 years or who has never had a job to inform that process.
Great, thank you. Rachel.
I think, what I'm gonna say, but to bounce off of what Raphael said, to reform the tax incentives that destroy those kinds of relationships and to use the cost savings to pump back into infrastructure planning and lowering of tax rates.
Great. Jeff.
I would like to see our policy folks spend a little bit more time and money getting some analytics to test their propositions rather than going in.
Good. Teresa, last word.
Build youth entrepreneurship programs targeting 18 to 24-year-olds who have become chronically employed, particularly because of policies that not only target them for criminalization, but then deny them access to the workplace afterwards.
Great. Thank you all for being here. I hope you have a sense that the conversation is really just beginning on this. And we hope you stay engaged with UIC and the forum and take advantage of the papers that have been written. Stay in tune with folks like Rachel and Teresa. We know that we can help the mayor. I mean, that's for sure. And Jeff is producing data every week that's important. And Raphael, we hope you come back and visit us. But thank you all for being with us. Thank you very much.